How was your day? Maybe there was a moment where you had the answer and stayed quiet anyway. Because the time wasn't right, or because no one asked. There was a god who always had the answer. His name was Thoth, scribe of the gods in Egyptian mythology. If today had a little of that, he knows what it costs to hold wisdom and say nothing until the moment arrives. You don't have to solve anything tonight. Just rest and listen. This story starts in a hall where the dead wait, and one god holds a pen that decides everything. The hall is silent. A soul stands at the threshold. Every choice it ever made compressed into the weight of a single human heart. Across the room, Thoth waits with his pen. Anubis places the heart on the scale. Ma'at's feather rises on the other side. The 42 judges lean forward. And Thoth, the god of all words, has not yet written a single one. He has done this 10,000 times. He will do it 10,000 more. But Thoth is not indifferent. That's the part that matters. He records truth. And he grieves every soul that falls short of it. A god who remembers every soul. Not just the powerful ones. Not just the righteous ones. Every single one. Maybe you know what it is to carry that kind of attention. To see things others walk past. This is what we do here. Every week, one story, one night. Something ancient that still has something to say. You don't have to do anything. Just listen. Get comfortable now. Find your warmth. If you drift off before the end, Thoth won't mind. He has watched over sleeping mortals since the first word was ever written. And this is only the beginning of his story. The part most people never reach. That's still ahead. But not tonight. Tonight, just this. If tonight felt like something, subscribe. We'll be here next week. Another story, another night like this. Now back to ours. Before there were words, there was silence. Then Thoth spoke. And the first thing he said was the name of everything. That's where this story begins. The ancient Egyptians said this differently. They said, in the beginning was Heka, magic itself. And Thoth was the one who gave magic its shape. He gave it words. Before Thoth named it, the river had no name. The fish had no names. The stars, those enormous fires above, had no names at all. And what has no name has no story. He was not born the way gods are usually born. He emerged, some say from the lips of Ra. Some say from his own thought. He knew himself into existence. The other gods noticed him immediately. Not because he was loud. Because he was the only one in the room who already knew what was going to happen, and said nothing. Ra made him scribe, not because Thoth was obedient, because Thoth was honest. In a court full of gods who wanted things, Thoth only wanted the truth recorded correctly. That reed pen, that palette, those two objects decided more fates than any sword ever forged in the workshops of the gods. Remember that, for later. In the beginning, the Egyptians said, there was only none. The dark water. No sky. No earth, no light. Just the vast, patient, unmoving deep. From that dark water, Ra emerged. He brought light. He brought the first day. But he was alone. And even the sun gets tired of its own silence. He thought, and his thought became shu, air. He spoke, and his words became tefnut, moisture. But the words themselves, they needed a keeper. That's when Thoth arrived, not summoned, not commanded. He was simply there. Standing beside the words, as if he had always been their guardian, and they had been waiting for him. He named the water. He named the sky. He named the fish in the water and the birds in the sky. Each name was a gift and a boundary. To name something is to say this exists, this matters. He invented mathematics, the language beneath language. He invented time, and then invented the way to measure it. He gave the moon its duties and the stars their paths. The other gods came to him with questions, always questions. Ra asked how to protect the solar bark. Osiris asked how to judge the dead fairly. Isis asked how to bring her husband back. He answered every one. Not because he needed to be needed. Because the answers existed, and withholding them would have been its own kind of lie. That's the part that stays with you. He could have made knowledge rare. He could have made wisdom something only gods could hold. He chose to give it to mortals instead, all of it. His sacred animals were the ibis and the baboon. The ibis for its stillness, the way it stands in water and watches before it moves. The baboon for its howling at dawn, the first sound that greets the sun. Thoth, the stillness before action. And the voice that greets each new morning as if it has never happened before and must be celebrated anyway. His city was Hermopolis, the city of the eight Kmun, where 4 pairs of primordial gods lived before the world existed darkness and invisibility, water and formlessness, air and eternity. The priests there trained as scribes. They rose before dawn. They washed. They opened their ink and began writing. Every day, the record of all things, an act of devotion, an act of memory. They believed that to write something was to make it real. Not metaphorically. Actually, the word for to create and to write were, for them, the same. So when Thoth wrote your name in the Hall of Two Truths, when that reed pen moved across that papyrus, that was not record keeping. That was creation. That was your story, fixed in the world forever. The Egyptians feared forgetting more than they feared death. To be forgotten was the true ending. Thoth protected against that. Every name he wrote would last. But Thoth was more than a scribe. He was the moon itself, walking. The disk on his head was not decoration. It was his nature. He governed the tides and the calendar and the turning of the year. Here's the part the myths never make obvious. The sun got all the temples and the festivals and the hymns. The moon worked quietly, governing time while the world slept. Sound familiar? The Egyptians called him Lord of the Divine Body, Lord of Divine Words. He was the tongue of Ra, meaning that what Ra willed, Thoth spoke into existence. There was a time when the gods were at war. Horus and Set, nephew and uncle, had been fighting for 80 years. 80 years, and both sides had legitimate claims. Set was chaos, necessary chaos. The wind in the desert, the storm that breaks the heat. He had power and he had right and he had grievance. Horus had a different kind of right. The gods argued. They took sides. They made decisions and unmade them. For 80 years, the throne of Egypt sat empty, while 2 gods bled for it. This moment is easy to miss, but it changes everything. Thoth did not take sides. This made certain gods furious. A scribe without allegiance. Was that loyalty? Was that cowardice? Was that wisdom? He said, give me the evidence. All of it. Every claim. Every grievance. Every year of the 80. I will write it down, and then I will read it back to you. And you will see what I see. When he finished, the hall was silent. He had written both cases so clearly, so completely, so fairly, that everyone could see the answer. It was there in the record. It had always been there. Horus received the throne. Set received the desert winds. His domain, his nature, his place. Not punishment, assignment. Thoth had found the answer that gave both gods what they truly were. But before any of that, before the throne was awarded, something worse had happened. During the long war, Set had torn out the eye of Horus, left him half blind, half a god. Thoth gathered the pieces. There were fragments of the eye scattered across the battlefield. Pieces of sight, pieces of power. He collected every one. 63 fragments. The Egyptians said the eye was 64 parts, and 63 could be found. The last fragment, Thoth made himself. From magic. From will, from the refusal to leave a god incomplete. He gave the restored eye to Horus, and that moment, the giving back, became one of the most sacred acts in all of Egyptian religion. The Wajet, the eye of protection. Maybe you know that feeling. Of being given back something you thought was gone. Something someone took the time to gather, piece by piece, and return to you whole. The eye of Horus became a symbol of healing and protection. You've seen it, carved on amulets, painted on tombs, worn around the necks of the living and the dead. Thoth put it there. Because here is what the Egyptians encoded in that eye. The fractions. The 64 parts of the eye each represented a fraction. 1/2, 1/4, 1/8. down to 64th. Together they made 63 64ths. Not quite whole. That last part, the magic Thoth added, was faith. 63 64ths of reason. The last 64th, belief. Thoth built that into a symbol and gave it to every Egyptian who would ever need healing. Remember that for later. Thoth served Ra most faithfully at night. When the sun god's bark entered the underworld, the Duat, it faced its greatest enemy, Apep, the serpent of chaos. Every single night, the bark had to pass Apep. Every single night, the serpent tried to swallow the sun and end the world. And every single night, it failed. Thoth's weapon against Apep was not a sword. It was his voice. He recited the names. He spoke the spells. He described the serpent so precisely and so completely that the serpent lost its power. Could not act against something that had been so fully named. The name was the weapon. Thoth knew this more than any god. To name something true. To say exactly what it is, without exaggeration, without softening. That is what stops the chaos. Here's the part that matters. Priests in every Egyptian temple performed this ritual daily. They recited Thoth's spells. They named Apep and destroyed the naming. They did this so Ra could cross each night. It was the most important job in the world, and no one outside the temple saw it being done. Invisible work. Necessary work. The kind that only stops mattering to everyone else when it stops being done. Maybe you've done that kind of work. Maybe you're doing it right now. Thoth's work in the Dot was one story. His work at the scales of Ma'at was another. Both happened every night. Every night, a soul arrived. Every night, the pen moved. The ancient Egyptians didn't build the Hall of Two Truths to frighten people. They built it to give them something the living world rarely provides. A moment of complete accounting. For the Egyptians, the heart was the seat of the self. Not the brain, the heart. Every thought, every choice, every grief and every joy lived in the heart. What weighed against Ma'at's feather was everything you truly were. A heavy heart, burdened by cruelty, by deception, by the weight of things done and undone, would tip the scale. Amit waited below, part lion, part crocodile, the devourer of souls. But most hearts, most ordinary hearts that had tried, that had loved imperfectly but sincerely, that had made mistakes and kept going, were light enough. And Thoth would write it down. And that was the end of fear. After the judgment, souls went to the field of reeds. Eru. Imagine a place exactly like the best Egypt you knew. The same Nile, the same palms, the same evening light, but without drought, without illness, without loss. Entr Ladi. The scribes of ancient Egypt trained for years. A boy who would become a scribe started his education at 4 or 5. He would still be learning at 20. They trained on pottery shards first, ostraka, because papyrus was expensive. Every piece of practice survived, the mistakes too. Archaeologists still find them 3,000 years later. A trained scribe was exempt from hard labor, from military service, from heavy taxation. Because Egypt understood what Thoth had always known. The person who holds the record holds a different kind of power. But scribes were also healers. Thoth's priests doubled as doctors. Because in Egypt, the word for sickness and the word for chaos were close cousins. And the cure for both was knowledge correctly applied. Thoth presided over all of it. Not because he demanded credit, because every act of writing, medical, legal, religious, practical, was a prayer in his direction whether the scribe knew it or not. The practice of writing itself was a form of worship. To sit and form the characters correctly, to say the right thing in the right way, was to do what Thoth did at the beginning of the world. This is why the Egyptians buried scribal equipment with their dead. Palette reeds ink. Not because the dead would write, but because in the field of reeds, in the good afterlife, you might need to keep the record there too. Thoth outlasted Egypt. When the Greeks arrived, when they conquered and renamed the world, they looked at Thoth and recognized someone they already knew. They called him Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus, thrice Great Hermes. The name they gave him said it all. He was great as a philosopher, great as a priest, great as a king. All three. At once. The Hermetic texts, the Corpus Hermeticum, were written in his name thousands of years after his Egyptian temples fell silent. Alchemists studied them. So did Renaissance scholars. So did Isaac Newton. As above, so below. That phrase, the most famous Hermetic principle, is Thoth's. The idea that the universe is a pattern. That the smallest things mirror the largest things. That understanding one is understanding the other. That came from the Scribe of the gods. He walked through human history. Not in temples, in ideas, in the habit of writing things down, in the belief that knowledge, carefully kept, outlasts everything. That's the part that stays with you. Everything you've ever read, every book that shaped you, every story that stayed with you, began with a God who decided words should exist. But we've gotten ahead of ourselves, because before all of that, before the Greeks and Newton and the Renaissance, Thoth had a problem, a debt, and the universe needed 5 extra days. Nut, the sky goddess, was pregnant. 5 children waiting to be born: Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis, Nephthys. But Ra had cursed her. She could not give birth on any day of any month of any year. Thoth went to the moon. Specifically, he went to Khonsu, the moon god, and he challenged him to a game. The game was Senet, an ancient Egyptian board game, like a combination of chess and backgammon, played by the living and the dead. Thoth played Khonsu for moonlight itself. Thoth won, and then won again, and then again and again and again, until he had won enough moonlight to make 5 new days. Days that existed outside the official calendar. Days that belonged to no month and no god. Those 5 days, called the epigomenal days, belonged to no official time. Ra's curse didn't cover them. Nut was free. Osiris was born first, god of the dead and resurrection, born in a gap in time, in days that didn't officially exist. Maybe that's why death and rebirth live at the edge of the calendar. In the days between, Isis was born fourth, the Great Mother, the goddess of magic and healing. She arrived in a day that didn't exist. Maybe that's why her power has never quite been explicable. She belongs to the days outside the system, all 5 of them, born because Thoth decided to gamble, because he saw the problem, saw the solution, and played a game against a god for the sake of a goddess he owed nothing to. He didn't ask for credit. He wrote it down in the record, filed it properly. That was enough for him. That's the part that matters. The moon was diminished by those winnings. Khonsu had lost enough light that the full moon no longer lasted all month. That's why the moon waxes and wanes. Because Thoth won too much at Senet. The Egyptians looked at the moon every night and saw the story. They saw the god of the moon playing Senet with the scribe, and losing, and giving back a little light each month, and winning it back again by the next full moon. Thoth governed that cycle. As moon god, the waxing and waning were his domain. He didn't win the light from Khonsu and keep it. He redistributed it, turned it into time, into the calendar, into 5 births that shaped all of history. That calendar lasted 3,000 years with almost no change. 3,000 years, a longer run than almost any human institution in history. Because Thoth got the math right the first time. Here's what stays with you. The god of wisdom didn't keep wisdom for the gods. He gave it to scribes. He gave time to mortals. He made the calendar for farmers and priests, not for himself. Wisdom in his hands was always pointing outward. And still, when night fell, he was back at the prow of Ra's bark, speaking the names, driving back the serpent, doing the work that no one outside the bark could see being done. There were nights in the Duat, deep in the labyrinth of the underworld, where Apep was stronger, darker, more vast. Nights where the serpent's coils filled the entire channel and the bark had nowhere to pass. On those nights, Thoth spoke longer, spoke more precisely, found the name of the darkness that Apep had been hiding behind, and spoke that name too. And the darkness had to give. It always had to give, because the dark has no words, and Thoth had all of them. There was a night unlike the others. Deep in the dot, the underworld passage, where even Thoth had never gone. A corridor without a name. That was the first warning. The other gods on the bark felt it too. A heaviness. Not fear. Gods don't fear the way mortals do. Something more like recognition. The feeling of approaching the thing you have been preparing for. Then the sound. A sound beneath sound. The breathing of something enormous. A pep was not in the channel ahead. A pep was the channel. The serpent had grown large enough to become the passageway itself. Set drew his spear. Horus raised his eye. The other gods readied their weapons, and Thoth stood still. Because he already knew that weapons were not what this night required. Ra looked at Thoth. Just looked. The way the sun looks at the moon, needing it to do what only it can do, in the hours when the sun cannot shine by itself. Thoth stepped to the prow. The darkness was total. He could not see the serpent, but he could hear it breathing, and he began to speak. He named the darkness. Not a pep, the darkness itself. He found the word for the specific quality of this specific darkness. The darkness that thinks it can end things. He named it precisely and completely. Then he named the cold. The cold that lives at the center of chaos. The hollow, hungry cold that isn't temperature but absence. He found the exact word for that too. He kept going. The despair that chaos carries. The weight of believing nothing can change. The particular silence that follows a world that has stopped trying. He named them all, one by one, in the ancient language that predates language. The other gods watched. Set lowered his spear, slowly. Horus lowered his eye. The battle was not the battle they had prepared for. It was something older and stranger and more necessary. Apep had no words. That was always the truth. Chaos has no language. It has weight and appetite and darkness, but it has never been able to name itself. And what cannot name itself cannot withstand the God who can. Thoth named the serpent's hunger. Named its age. Older than the world, born before names existed, which meant born before it could be hurt by them. But now there were names. And now it could be hurt. The last name Thoth spoke was the name of the dawn. Not the dawn that was coming. The dawn that had already happened 10,000 times and would happen again. The certainty of it, spoken like a fact into the dark. The serpent fled, not destroyed. It never could be destroyed. It lived in the dark between things. But it fled, and the channel opened, and the bark moved forward. Ra said nothing to Thoth afterward. There was nothing to say. What Thoth had done was what Thoth always did. Seen the problem, found the words, held the darkness back. It was simply larger this time. You've been there. Not in the Doat, but in your own version of it. The night that presses differently. The darkness that feels like it has a specific weight and a specific intention. And the moment when you had to find words for it. Just to keep going. The bark emerged from the dot as the sky began to lighten. Not gold yet. The particular gray that comes before gold. When the world is deciding whether it will work again. It always does. But it has to decide every time. Dawn. The baboons on the rocks opened their mouths. The ibis flocks lifted from the river. The priests in Hermopolis put down their lamps and opened their temple doors. Another night survived. Thoth watched the sun rise. He always did, not with relief, with something quieter. The satisfaction of a completed record. One more night. Fully witnessed, fully written. The universe a little more real for being documented. Then he went to the Hall of Two Truths. Because the night was over and the judgments were waiting. The souls that had arrived during the dark hours, patient in the antechamber, Thoth opened his palate. The first soul was a farmer from the Delta. He had lived a small life, nothing heroic, nothing terrible. He had grown grain. He had loved his family. He had cursed the flood one year when it came too high. Anubis placed the heart on the scale. The feather rose. The heart settled. They balanced, perfectly, quietly, without drama. Thoth dipped his pen and wrote this one past. The farmer moved toward the field of reeds. he would grow grain there. But grain that never failed, in soil that never exhausted. The same life. Just better. Just free of the things that broke it. The next soul was harder. A nobleman who had been powerful and who had used that power carelessly. Not with cruelty exactly. With indifference. The worst kind of heaviness. Thoth did not flinch. He watched the scale tip. He recorded what he saw. He did not look away, but he did not look with satisfaction either. This was never what he wanted the record to show. That's the part that matters. He grieved the souls that fell short. He never stopped grieving them. But he never let the grief change the record. Because a record that bends to feeling is not a record. It is a wish. Here's the part the myths never make obvious. Thoth never argued for a soul to pass. Some gods did, Isis pleaded, Osiris considered, Ra's favor could shift things. Thoth only ever read the record. Stay with this, it matters before the end. He believed, in the way that only a god of wisdom can believe, that the truth, completely told, is itself the most generous thing. That a record showing you your actual life is a gift, not a punishment. The hall processed souls all day, into the evening. Thoth wrote until the light failed and the lamps were lit, and the writing continued by lamplight. He never asked for rest. Maat was always present. She stood near the scale and said almost nothing. The feather was her nature made into an object. When it balanced with a heart, it meant the heart had lived in accordance with her existence. They had an understanding, Thoth and Maat. The kind that doesn't require words between two people. Two gods, who have worked together since the beginning of the world. Some ancient texts say they were married. Others say they were aspects of the same principle, truth and its record inseparable. Either way, where Maat stood, Thoth was always nearby, with his pen. Osiris presided over the hall from his throne, green-skinned, crowned, wrapped in the white of the mummified. The god of the dead watched every judgment, with the weight of his own death still on him. Thoth had helped bring Osiris back from the dead. When Set had scattered Osiris's body, 14 pieces across 14 places, it was Thoth who provided Isis with the spells she needed to reassemble her husband. The spells were real spells, not metaphors. Every word placed precisely, every sound correct. Thoth had written them at the beginning of time, knowing this moment would come, knowing Osiris would be killed. And still, he wrote the way back. He wrote the ending before the story began. Not to control it, to ensure there was always a way back. Thoth believed in return, in restoration, in the power of having written down the path before the path was needed. That's what the Book of the Dead really was. Thoth's instructions, given to the living before they died, for what to say in the hall. The words that would let a heart speak for itself. He gave mortals the cheat sheet for their own judgment. Maybe you know that feeling of being given the words for something before you needed them. A parent who told you something years before it mattered. A book that prepared you for a moment you couldn't have anticipated. Thoth wrote those words for everyone. For the farmer, for the nobleman, for the child who would die before anyone expected, for the soldier and the priest and the fisherwoman and the slave. No hierarchy in his archive. Every name equally kept. He was the first librarian, the first archivist, the first to understand that the record is not for the one who keeps it. The record is for the one who needs it. The other gods came to him with their greatest problems, and Thoth listened to all of them, not just the gods with power, not just the requests that were convenient, all of them, every time. There was a lesser goddess, Seshat, goddess of libraries and measurement. She was Thoth's counterpart, sometimes his wife. She measured the foundations of temples with a measuring rod before the first stone was laid. She measured, he recorded. The foundation, then the record of the foundation. The event, then the archive of the event. Together they ensured that nothing built and nothing that happened would be lost or misaligned. There was a particular story told about Thoth and a serpent. Not Apep, but a smaller story. A serpent that had been cursed and couldn't die, but couldn't truly live either. Thoth sat beside it. He asked the serpent its name. The serpent said it had forgotten, and Thoth spent 3 days helping it remember. Because a creature without a name is outside the record, and outside the record is outside the possibility of healing. When the serpent remembered its name, the curse broke. Not because the name had power over the curse, but because a creature that knows what it is cannot be kept in a state of not being. Identity is its own kind of protection. That's all. The serpent recovered and continued. Thoth returned to his desk. But the principle stayed. In every book of the dead, in every hall of two truths, in every name he ever wrote. Know what you are. It protects you. The Horus set war had ended. The calendar had been given its 5 extra days. The eye of Horus had been healed. But Thoth's greatest test was still coming. It would come from inside, from a question he had never let himself ask. The question came from a young scribe who arrived at his temple with unusual directness. He asked, "You know everything. You have written everything. Is there anything that cannot be fixed by knowing it completely?" Intir udb. The eye of Horus was not just a religious symbol. The ancient Egyptians built mathematics into it. Each of the 6 parts of the eye represented a different fraction used in everyday measurement. For grain, for medicine, for land. 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, 1/64. Added together they make 63 64ths. The missing piece, the last 64th, was the magic Thoth supplied. Egyptian doctors used these fractions when they measured medicine. The precision of an ancient healer, weighing poppy or willow bark or ground herbs, was guided by a symbol that also meant the healed eye of a god, medicine and myth in the same gesture. And in the grain storehouse, where the state's wealth lived, the same fractions guided every transaction. The sacred eye watched over harvests, over taxes, over the food that kept the civilization alive. Thoth's mathematics everywhere, visible in everything. This is what Thoth built. Not just a symbol for a healed eye, a system. A way of seeing the world where the sacred and the practical are not separate things. Where the mathematics of a god's restored sight governs the weight of grain that feeds a family. That came from the scribe who healed what was broken and encoded the healing in the tools everyone uses. Back to the young scribe. He had asked his question. Thoth had been silent for a long time, longer than the scribe expected, longer than felt comfortable. Finally, Thoth said, "There is one thing that knowing cannot fix." He said it quietly, like someone who had known this for a long time and had been waiting to be asked before saying it aloud. "Grief," he said. "Not the grief of a soul in the hall that can be weighed and recorded. The grief of the living who remain, the ones who are left with the record and not the person. I have written every name. I cannot give anyone back their dead." The young scribe was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Is that why you gave us writing? So we could write their names down ourselves? So the living could keep the record when the god isn't there?" Thoth said yes. That is exactly why. He looked at the young scribe for a long time after that. Then he opened a drawer in his great desk and took out the finest reed pen in his collection. He gave it to the boy. "Write the names," Thoth said. "Write them carefully. Write them while you can still ask the person how they want to be remembered. That's not grief. That's preparation. And preparation is the only thing that makes loss survivable. You've been there. Maybe you know what it is to wish you had written something down before you lost the chance to ask. And maybe you know what it is to have written it down, and to hold that writing like a hand." The young scribe became Thoth's most devoted priest. He served in Hermopolis for 40 years. He trained other scribes. He told them Thoth's answer about grief, and gave each of them a reed pen on the day they mastered their letters. And still the night came, and still Thoth took his place at the prow of the solar barkie. And still Apep waited in the dark below the world. Some problems are not solved, they are met night after night, with full attention. There is a concept in the Egyptian texts called Zep Tepi, the first time, the original moment when the world came into being correctly. Every ritual, every judgment, every night journey was an attempt to repeat Zep Tepi, to be as close to the original perfection as possible. Thoth embodied Zep Tepi more than any other god, because every time he picked up his pen, every time he found the correct word, the exactly right hieroglyph, he was doing what he had done at the beginning, naming things into existence, again, correctly. The greatest moment of his story was coming. The test that would answer the question the young scribe had really been asking, not about grief, but about whether a god of pure wisdom could also act, could choose, could step outside the record and into the thing being recorded. Osiris had been killed. Set had sealed him in a golden coffin and thrown him in the Nile. Then, when Isis found the body, Set had cut it into 14 pieces and scattered them across Egypt. Isis found 13, the 14th, the one piece that completed Osiris, was in the Nile, gone lost. A god incomplete in a way that even Thoth's mathematics couldn't fully account for. She came to Thoth. Not calmly. She arrived at his door in the middle of the night, wings still spread, her grief preceding her into the room like weather. She told him everything. He already knew. He had the record. But he let her tell him. Because there is wisdom in letting the grief speak, in not interrupting the story with the fact that you already know how it ends. When she was finished, he asked one question: do you want him back entirely, or do you want him back enough to continue? She said enough to continue. She needed Osiris restored enough to conceive Horus, the heir who would reclaim the throne and establish the divine order. One purpose, one enough. Thoth gave Isis the spells for temporary restoration, not resurrection. The Egyptians distinguished carefully between the two. This was the breathing of life into something that was mostly gone, long enough for purpose to be served. She performed the ritual. Thoth's spells in her voice, the most powerful magic in existence given to the most powerful magician, spoken over a body that had been scattered and reassembled with one piece missing. Horus was conceived, the heir to the throne of Egypt, who would one day challenge Set and reclaim the kingdom. Born from loss. Born from the gap in a god's body and the spell Thoth had written before it was needed. Osiris returned to the underworld. Permanent this time, not destroyed, restored to his full nature as god of the dead, the ruler of what comes after. Given his proper place at last by the death Set had tried to use as an ending. Thoth wrote the whole sequence in his record. Every step, the murder, the search, the spells, the brief return, the departure. The story of how the god of the dead became the god of the dead properly. He wrote it without editorial. Just the truth of what happened. Now Horus was growing, and Set still sat on the throne, and the world was waiting for the conflict that Thoth had already seen coming, and had already quietly begun to prepare for. The war lasted 80 years. We've seen it from a distance. Now we see it from inside. The part Thoth watched but could not control. The part that required him to hold his neutrality against everything he felt. Set tore out Horus's eye in the 43rd year. Thoth saw it happen. He was there. He watched the act of violence and recorded it, and did not intervene. That was the hardest thing he had ever done. But once the violence was complete, once it was in the record as an event, Thoth moved. He gathered the pieces. He spent 40 days collecting every fragment of the injured eye. 63 pieces from 64 possible. The 64th piece, the last 64th, was gone. Not lost, consumed. The violence had eaten it. And here is what Thoth did that no god had ever done before. He created a piece of the eye from nothing. Not from found material, from pure will. From his knowledge of what the eye was supposed to be. He wrote the description of the missing 64th so completely that the description became the thing described. He went to Horus. The falcon god was in his chambers, diminished, in pain, his vision halved, his power reduced. Thoth entered without ceremony. He simply held out the eye. Horus did not ask how. He understood that what Thoth had done was outside the normal order of things. And that asking how would be like asking water how it became rain. Some gifts are larger than their explanation. The war continued. But Horus was whole again. The balance had shifted. What Set had used to tip the scales, the injury, the diminishment, had been undone by the god who deals in restoration. The outcome was no longer uncertain. Thoth called the great Ennead together, the 9 most senior gods of the Egyptian pantheon. He said, "The record is complete. I am prepared to present it. The verdict can be rendered now." He read the record aloud, all of it. Set's legitimate grievance, Horus's legitimate claim, every act of violence, every act of justice. Every moment where the truth had been obscured by the need to win. He read it all. The last section he read was about the eye. What Set had done. What Thoth had spent 40 days repairing. He read it without emphasis. Just as it happened, in the order it happened, the facts were emphasis enough. When Thoth finished reading, the hall was completely silent. Not the silence before a verdict. The silence after understanding. The silence of people who have seen the answer, and know it is the answer, and cannot argue with it. Ra spoke first. He said Horus receives the throne of Egypt. Set receives the desert winds, the storms, the necessary chaos that keeps the world turning. Both gods receive what they truly are. The war is over. Horus stood. He had won. But he stood like a man who understood that winning looked exactly like being correctly seen. Not like a warrior. Like someone who had waited, and endured, and finally had the record read aloud. Set walked out. Not in defeat, in something more complex. Wearing the outcome the way a force of nature wears its assignment. The desert received him. The storm straightened when he arrived. The world needed his chaos. It always had. The other gods looked at Thoth. He had done what none of them could have done. Stayed neutral for 80 years. Gathered every piece of truth. Read it aloud without favor. The verdict had been in the record from the beginning. He had simply waited until everyone was ready to hear it. He returned to his desk. He filed the verdict. He opened the next scroll. Outside, Egypt was being ruled by Horus for the first time. The kingdom in the hands it had always been destined for. Inside, the scribe went back to work. That's all. That's the end of the war, and the work continues. After the verdict, the world was quiet. Not the quiet of sleep, the quiet of a thing that has been set right. Egypt under Horus, the desert under Set, the record under Thoth, the order restored. 3 days passed like that. 3 days where everything worked. Where the Nile ran at the right depth. Where the grain stored correctly. Where the dead arrived at the hall in the expected numbers, and passed or didn't pass, and it was sad but orderly. On the 4th night, something changed in the record. Thoth noticed it before anyone else. A discrepancy. A soul that should have arrived at the hall hadn't. A name in the book of the dead that didn't match a body in the dot. He checked again, then a 3rd time. The record was clear. A soul, one that had lived well, one whose heart should have been light, had entered the dot and not reached the hall. It was somewhere in the passage. Lost. A lost soul in the dot was not unprecedented. The passage was complex, the underworld vast. But this soul had vanished, completely. No trail in the record. As if something had erased the path behind it. Thoth descended into the dot himself. Not on the solar bark, alone. Just his lamp and his pen and the names of things. Looking for one soul the record said existed, and the underworld said did not. The corridor was different from the nightly passage. Quieter. The dot without Ra's bark moving through it felt like a house after its family has left. The same rooms, the same walls, but the meaning removed. He found the place where the trail ended. A section of the passage he had never needed to name before. Because the souls that moved through here always moved through quickly, following the correct path. An unmapped place in the dot. That alone was almost impossible. Thoth had written the Doat's entire geography before the first soul arrived, but this passage was not in any scroll. It had not been there, and now it was. He stepped into it. Pen ready. Not a weapon, a tool. His way of engaging with anything unknown was the same: begin naming it. Start with what you can describe. The rest will follow. The passage led downward, deeper than the standard Duat depth, deeper than the level where Ra's Barki normally traveled, into a part of the underworld that preceded the world, that existed before the gods ordered things. And there, in the oldest part of the world, Thoth found the lost soul, a woman. She was sitting in the dark, perfectly calm, looking at something Thoth could not immediately see. She looked up when he arrived, not startled, as if she had been expecting him, or expecting someone eventually. She said, "I found something. I couldn't leave it." Thoth looked at what she was watching. In the deepest dark, in the part of the underworld that existed before the world, there was a crack in the stone, and from the crack, very faintly, came light. He had no name for it. Thoth, who had a name for everything, stood before the crack in the oldest stone and had nothing. Not because he was ignorant, because this was new, genuinely, impossibly new. The woman said, "I heard it from the passage above. It called me down." Not a voice, a feeling. Like something on the other side of a wall, wanting to be let through. I couldn't leave it alone. Thoth thought for a long time. The light was not Apep. Apep was darkness. It was not Ra. Ra's light was above. It was not any god he had recorded. It was something that had been waiting in the oldest stone for the world to be ready to find it. He opened his scroll. He began to write, not the thing's name, because he didn't know it. He wrote its qualities. The light that exists before light was invented. The presence that precedes presence. The knowledge that predates knowing. As he wrote, the light steadied. Whatever was on the other side of the crack, it recognized the attempt, not the name, just the trying. The reaching toward it with whatever tools you have. The woman asked, "What is it?" Thoth said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Is that allowed? For the god of wisdom to not know something?" He said, "It is required. The alternative is pretending." Maybe you know that feeling of sitting with something you cannot name yet. Not because the name doesn't exist, but because you haven't earned it yet, haven't spent enough time in its presence. Thoth told the woman she needed to continue to the hall, that her heart was waiting to be weighed, that staying in the deep dark, even in the presence of something extraordinary, was not where her story ended. She went and Thoth stayed. He sat before the crack for 3 days, alone in the oldest part of the world, writing everything he could observe about the light he could not name. He wrote what light does when nothing else exists to see it by. He wrote what the silence sounds like at the bottom of the universe. He wrote about the weight of old stone and the patience of things that have been waiting since before waiting was a concept. On the 3rd day, the light spoke. Not in words, in understanding. A single recognition passing through the crack and through Thoth's chest. This is what existed before the first time. This is what Ra came from. This is the source. He wrote 2 words at the top of the accumulated pages. He crossed out every other description. He started again, cleaner, truer. The way a scribe does when the drafts have done their work and the real writing can begin. He sealed the scroll. He placed it in the deepest section of his library, not the general archive, the section reserved for things that were true but not yet ready to be widely known, the things in process, the things becoming. He returned from the Dot carrying that scroll and a new question. The old question, can wisdom fix everything, had been answered. No, but this question was deeper. What is wisdom for if not to fix things? The answer was not in any existing scroll. He had checked. The answer was in the new thing, the light behind the crack. And the new thing was not yet ready to explain itself. So Thoth did what he always did when he didn't have the answer. He continued working and waited for the question to ripen. Outside, the solar barkie was preparing for the night crossing. Ra was settling into his descent. The crew was assembling: Horus, Set, the divine sailors. They were looking for Thoth. He was already there. The night crossing began as it always did. Ra's bark moving into the mouth of the dot. The darkness receiving them. The crew settling into their stations. But Thoth carried the new question with him. And the night felt different for it. Set was at the stern. The chaos god had accepted his assignment. The desert, the storms. But on the bark he served as guardian still. They had worked together for a long time without speaking about it directly. Set said, "Without looking up, you've been different since you came back from the deep dot." Thoth said yes. Set said, "Is it going to be a problem tonight?" Thoth said, "I don't think so." Set said, "Good enough." The first third of the crossing was quiet. Standard darkness, standard passage. The souls of the dead moving through on their own routes. Thoth named what he saw as he always did. The pen moved. The record grew. In the second third, the darkness thickened. Not apep. Not that kind of thickening. This was different. A density without appetite. A heaviness without intention. The darkness of something that had stopped trying. Thoth had a name for it by the second breath. Stagnation. The darkness of a world that has forgotten it can change. Not evil, nothing so active. Just stopped. He began to speak. He named stagnation every way he knew. The stopped river. The field that forgot rain. The year that couldn't end. The grief that hardens into silence. He named all the forms of the thing that forgets to continue. Ra's light steadied as the passage cleared. The sun god looked at Thoth. Something passed between them. Recognition of a new kind of darkness named, and a new kind of tool used against it. The barkie moved on. In the third section of the crossing, they found Apep, the old enemy, the original darkness. But something was different. Apep was smaller than Thoth had ever seen it. As if the serpent had been spending its strength elsewhere. Where had Apep's strength been going? Thoth thought of the crack in the deep dot. The light behind it. The unnamed source that predated everything. Something was feeding on the chaos, and using it for something else entirely. This was the new threat. Not Apep growing larger. Apep being used. Something in the oldest stone was consuming chaos and converting it into light. Into the faint gold glow that the woman had followed into the deep dark. A thing that converts chaos into light. Thoth had never encountered this before. He had recorded chaos. He had recorded light. He had never recorded the process of one becoming the other. Because it had never happened in the world's organized history. He named the process as best he could. Transmutation. The changing of a thing's fundamental nature through directed attention. He wrote the word and then stared at it. He had invented the word. And the word felt more important than he expected. Set appeared at his shoulder. The chaos god had heard the word. He said transmutation. That's what happens to me, in the desert. The sand becomes glass when lightning strikes it. I never had a name for it. Thoth wrote it down. Here's the part that matters. The night that Thoth invented the concept of transmutation. Standing on Ra's bark in the Doat, with Set looking over his shoulder. Was the night that made alchemy possible. Made chemistry possible. Made physics possible. He didn't know that yet. He just wrote it down. The bark emerged from the dot into the pre-dawn gray. Thoth filed the night scroll. He opened the Hall of Two Truths. He dipped his pen. He waited for the first soul of the morning. The work continued. Days passed. Thoth returned to the deep dot each time he could. The crack was still there. The light still came through it. He brought more scrolls. He wrote more descriptions. The archive of the unnamed thing grew. On one visit he brought a young scribe, one of the students from Hermopolis. He asked the scribe to look at the crack and say, without thinking, what they saw. The scribe said potential, and Thoth wrote that down too. Potential. The light that exists before what it will become has been decided. The energy stored in the crack of the oldest stone. Not yet anything specific waiting to be directed. That was the source. That was what predated Ra. Ra came from potential. The gods came from potential. The world came from potential. And it was still there, in the oldest stone, in the deepest dark, waiting for more world to be made from it, waiting to be used again. This moment is easy to miss, but it changes everything. Thoth understood in the deep dark what the priests would say for thousands of years without knowing the source. That the sacred and the practical are the same light, just at different stages of becoming. He sealed the final scroll on the unnamed light. He wrote 2 words on the outside, the name he had found on the 3rd day, confirmed now by everything he'd learned since. He placed it with the others. The woman whose soul he had found in the deep dot had passed her judgment. Her heart had been light. She was in the field of reeds now, probably working, probably near water, probably happy. He thought of her sometimes, not often. He thought of the way she had sat in absolute darkness in the oldest part of the world and said, "I found something. I couldn't leave it." That was wisdom, not as kind, but real. She hadn't needed to know the name of what she found. She needed to stay with it until the God who did know names arrived. That was her part. His part was different. Together they had located the source. Years moved. The Nile rose and fell. Horus ruled well. Set managed his deserts and his storms with the satisfaction of a god correctly assigned. Ra continued his crossings. Thoth continued everything else. There came a night when Ra called Thoth to the center of the bark. Not the center, where Ra himself sat. The sun god said, "I need to ask you something." Thoth said, "I know." Ra said, "Then ask it for me." Ra said, through Thoth's voice, as Thoth had offered, "What am I for, now that the world is in order? The war is done. The calendar is set. The dead are judged. Horus rules. What is my purpose in a world that runs correctly?" Thoth was quiet. He was quiet the way he had been quiet in the deep dot. Not avoiding the question, but sitting with it until the honest answer arrived. Ra waited. He knew this silence. He trusted it. Thoth said, "You are the reason things continue, not the reason they started." That was potential, the source, the crack in the oldest stone. You are the reason they keep going. Every morning, the world chooses again. You are the choice. Ar said, "And you?" Thoth said, "I am the memory that the choice was made. Without the record, the morning would happen and no one would know it had. You give the light. I keep the proof that it came." Ra put his hand on Thoth's shoulder, briefly, just for a moment. Then he went back to his seat. Thoth went back to the prow. Neither of them said anything else. That was all that needed to be said. Maybe you know that feeling of a question about your own purpose finally becoming clear. Not because someone explained it to you, but because the circumstances arranged themselves until the answer was the only thing left. The second half of the crossing that night was the quietest Thoth had ever known. Not ominous quiet. The quiet of 2 gods who had just said exactly what needed to be said, and needed nothing more from the rest of the night. Intar-Ludc. The concept Thoth named transmutation moved through history in ways he could not have mapped. The Egyptians called it the transformation of matter. The Greeks called it alchemy. They believed that base metals could be converted to gold. They were wrong about the gold, but right about the principle. Matter can be transformed. Energy converts between forms. The fundamental insight came from a god standing on a bark in the dark, watching chaos become light, writing what he saw. The Hermetic texts that came from Thoth, the Corpus Hermeticum, were rediscovered in Florence in 1463. Cosimo de' Medici ordered them translated immediately. The Renaissance followed. The scientific revolution followed. All of it downstream from the Egyptian scribe. The principles above, so below, became the foundation of analogy in science. If the universe repeats its patterns at every scale, if the atom mirrors the solar system, then studying one reveals the other. That was Thoth's insight from watching the dot mirror the living world. And in medicine, the insight that a human body is a small version of the universe. subject to the same transformations, healable by the same principles that came from Egyptian thought, from Thoth's mathematics, from the eye of Horus in every medicine chest. Thoth's reach is everywhere you look if you know where to look. In the calendar, in chemistry, in medicine, in the habit of writing things down, in the belief that the record matters, in the morning when the sun comes back. Ein Trudd. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the principle Thoth served, was not simple justice. It was the pattern of right order in all things, the right depth of the Nile, the right weight of the grain, the right words in the right order. When a pharaoh was crowned, they said they were upholding Ma'at. When a judge made a ruling, they were upholding Ma'at. When a scribe wrote a document correctly, they were upholding Ma'at. The principle ran through everything, and Thoth kept the record of whether it was being honored. There were times, Egypt has a long history, when Ma'at was violated, when pharaohs acted against justice, when the grain was hoarded and the people starved. Thoth wrote it down, all of it, without softening. That's the part that stays with you. History that tells only its victories isn't history. It's propaganda. Thoth kept the full record, the rises and the falls, the Ma'at observed and the Ma'at abandoned. Because the fall recorded honestly is itself a lesson, and the God of wisdom never wasted a lesson. The night of the final test arrived without announcement. Most important nights do. The bark entered the Doat as usual. The darkness was usual. Thoth was at the prow, Ra was at the center, Set was at the stern. In the deepest third of the crossing, where Apep usually waited, there was nothing. No serpent, no darkness with appetite, just the passage, clean and empty and entirely wrong. Thoth looked at the empty channel. He looked at the walls, at the floor of the dot. He looked at the crack, the one he had found in the deep passage, the one he had spent months documenting. It was wider. The light from the crack was consuming the dot around it. Not violently, quietly, the way a lamp in a dark room eventually makes the whole room visible. The potential light was becoming actual light, and it was doing it from the bottom of everything. Set said this is what happened to Apep. The serpent wasn't diminished, it was converted. The chaos became the light. The darkness became the source. Set had understood it before Thoth, because he is chaos, and he had felt himself being pulled toward the same transformation. Ra looked at the light rising from the Doat floor. He said, quietly, just to Thoth, is this the beginning of something or the end? Thoth said, I believe it is both. Ra said, that's the truest thing you've ever told me. The potential light kept rising, through the floor of the dot, through the organized passages, through the levels where souls traveled. It reached the surface of the world, the living world, just before dawn. The priests in Hermopolis were preparing for the morning ritual. They had done it 10,000 times. The recitation of the names, the welcoming of Ra, the scribal work that preceded sunrise. This morning they stopped mid-ritual. The head priest, a man who had spent 40 years in service, said, I don't know what this is. Which was the most honest thing said in a temple in decades. And the light responded to honesty the way it always had. It brightened. The Barki arrived at dawn's threshold, the edge of the underworld, the point where Ra's disk would rise. But the light was already there, rising from below, meeting Ra's light from above. Two sources. For the first time in the world's history, two sources. Thoth stood at the threshold, between the underworld and the world, between the source and the expression, between the unnamed thing and the named thing. He had his pen, he had his scroll, he had his whole archive behind him. And Thoth wrote, not frantically, carefully, the way he had written everything since the beginning of the world, one word after another. The truth of what was happening, exactly as it happened, in the order it happened. Ra's disk rose. The sun crossed the horizon. But this morning the light that followed it was different. Not just solar, not just the daily gift. It carried the ancient potential beneath it. The world was receiving everything at once. The baboons on the rocks opened their mouths. But this morning the sound was different, deeper, longer, as if they understood something new about what they were greeting. The ibis flocks rose from the river and turned, once, toward the east, before continuing north. Thoth sealed the scroll. He labeled it. He added it to the general archive, not the deep section, not the section for things in process. The general archive, because this was no longer in process. This had happened. This was history now. He went to the Hall of Two Truths. The day's souls were waiting. He opened his palette. He dipped his pen. He waited for the scale to move. He thought about what Ra had said, that this was both a beginning and an end. Thoth had written the truest thing he knew. And now he understood why the woman in the deep dark had sat in front of the crack for so long without leaving. She hadn't known it was important. She had just found something she couldn't leave. That, Thoth wrote in the margin of the day's last scroll, is the beginning of all scholarship, all medicine, all devotion. Find something you can't leave, stay. Maybe you know that. The thing you can't leave alone. The subject that keeps pulling your attention back. The question that won't resolve. That's not a distraction. That's direction. That's the thing finding you because you're the one who will stay with it. Thoth's days continued. The work continued. But everything after the merging of the two lights had a different quality. The way a room is different. When you open a window you didn't know was there, the same room, more air. Ra noticed it too. The sun's light was different after that morning, not brighter, but deeper. As if light had always had a floor it had never reached before. The Egyptians noticed that the colors of things were somehow more themselves in the days that followed. The priests in Hermopolis added a new line to the morning ritual. After the recitation of names, after the welcoming of Ra, there was now a moment of silence, in recognition of what comes from below, as well as what comes from above. Thoth wrote the new ritual into the archive, filed it with the older rituals, made a note linking it to the scroll from the deep Doat, the night on the bark, the woman in the dark, the record complete. Years later, a different young scribe came to Thoth with a different question. He asked, "What is the most important thing you have written?" Thoth thought about this for a long time. He said, "Not any single scroll. The most important thing I have written is the connection between scrolls. The way one true thing, written carefully, leads to the next true thing, written carefully. The archive is not the records. It is the relationships between them." The scribe wrote this down. He had brought his reed pen. He wrote, "The connections are more important than the records." He looked at it. He crossed it out. He wrote, "The connections are the record." Thoth nodded. That was it. Night fell. The bark assembled. Thoth took his place at the prow. The duat opened. He entered the darkness carrying all of it, every night behind him, every scroll, every name, every judgment, the archive on his back like wings. The night passage was different now, with the potential, light active in the dot floor. The passage was slightly brighter than it had always been, not bright enough to make the work unnecessary, bright enough to see a little further ahead, smaller than ever, the chaos reduced by its ongoing conversion, but still present, still necessary. Thoth named it with the same precision as always. The serpent recoiled as always. The bark he passed as always. Set, at the stern, called forward still smaller. Thoth called back yes. Set good. Thoth yes. And that was the conversation. The two gods at opposite ends of the bark, keeping each other informed across the darkness, the way long-practiced colleagues do. The bark reached the deepest third. The crack was visible now, the light from it steady and present, an established feature of the underworld rather than a discovery. Thoth stopped at it, briefly, on his way to the threshold. He put his hand near the light. Not in it, near it. The warmth of the oldest thing in the world reached his palm. He held his hand there for one breath, then he went back to his post. This is the part of the story most people never reach. the part where the hero returns to ordinary work after the revelation. And the ordinary work is different because of what they've understood, but looks exactly the same from outside. That's where most of us live. Not in the revelation moment, in the morning after, in the day after the night in the deep dark, in the return to the ordinary that carries the extraordinary inside it. The bark reached the threshold. Dawn was waiting. The pre-dawn gray that always precedes gold. The moment of decision. Will the world work again? It always does. But it has to decide every time. Thoth's pen was ready. Ra's disc caught the first thread of light at the horizon. Below, through the Doat floor, the potential light rose to meet it. The two sources completing each other. The arc of the night's journey finding its end in the day's beginning. Thoth wrote the entry. Morning arrived. As it always does, the sources met. The record continues. He sealed the night scroll. He began the day scroll. He opened the hall. The work continued. Set walked past Thoth's desk on his way to the desert. He paused. He said, "You wrote that plainly." Thoth said, "It happened plainly." Set nodded. He went to his desert. The storms were waiting. Horus arrived at the hall later that morning. He had come to observe. The Falcon King sitting in the corner of the Hall of Two Truths, watching Thoth work. He said nothing. After 3 hours he left. At the door he said, "I understand now why you never asked for anything." Thoth did look up. Once Horus was gone. He wrote in the margin of that hour's record, "The king came to see." The king understood. This too is a kind of record. When those with power look carefully at those who serve and see what the service costs and choose it anyway. Days, more days. The calendar turning on the mathematics Thoth had given it. The moon waxing and waning on the det Khonsu still honored. The sun rising on the potential below it. The dead arriving in the expected numbers. There came an afternoon when Thoth stopped writing. Mid-sentence, the pen raised. He looked at the scroll before him, and then at the library, and then at the window, where the afternoon light came in carrying the double quality he had first noticed after the sources merged. He thought, "I have written the names of everything. I have written the record of everything. I have written the connections between everything. The archive is as complete as it can be while the world continues to produce events. And the world will always produce more events. So the archive will never be finished. And that is exactly right." He dipped his pen. He finished the sentence. He started the next one. Outside, a young scribe was walking toward the temple, carrying his pallet. Arriving for his morning lesson, about to discover for the first time what it meant to put a true thing in writing. Thoth looked up, saw the boy approaching, set his pen down. He went to the door. He would begin, as he always did, by asking, "What brought you here?" Because the first answer, before the training, before the practice, was the truest thing the scribe would ever produce. The boy said, "My teacher sent me." Thoth said, "That's the official reason." I asked, "What brought you?" The boy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I keep finding things I can't explain, and I want to know how to explain them." Thoth said, "Come in." As it always had, as it always would. The boy at his pottery shard, making the first marks. The pen finding the form. The character beginning to take shape under an uncertain hand. Thoth corrected him once. The boy made the same mistake again. Thoth corrected him again. The boy made it a third time. Thoth said, "Why does your hand keep returning to that shape?" The boy thought. He said, "Because it feels more honest than the correct one." Thoth said, "Then learn both, and choose deliberately." The training continued. The shard became a small scroll. The small scroll became a longer one. The boy's hand steadied. His marks became precise. And then, as it always happened, he started asking questions. He asked if writing creates reality. If the word and the thing are the same. Then what happens when something happens that no one writes down? Does it still count? Thoth put his pen down. He looked at the boy for a long time. He said, "Yes, it counts. The universe doesn't require a witness to proceed, but the witness, The one who writes it down is changed by the act, not the event, the witness. Writing doesn't give reality to the event. Writing gives meaning to the witness. That night, Thoth went to the bark. The last great night. Not the last night he would ever serve, but the one where everything came together. The deep dot, the potential light, the new student, the answer about the witness. All of it arriving at once in the darkness. But this time, for the first time in the entire history of the night crossing, a pep spoke. Not sound, not pressure, a question. In the oldest language, the one beneath language, the one Thoth had spoken at the beginning, what will you do when the archive is complete? Thoth answered without hesitation. He said the archive is never complete. The world keeps producing events. I keep writing them down. This will continue until the last moment. And in the last moment, I will write that too. And the record will be complete. And it will have been worth it entirely. The serpent moved aside. Not fled, moved. With intention. The bark passed, and Thoth wrote in his scroll. Quickly Apep asked a question tonight. The chaos wanted to know if the work was worth it. I said yes. The chaos was satisfied. The passage cleared. The bark reached the threshold. The potential light rose from below. Rar's disk rose from above. The two sources met at the horizon. Thoth sealed the night scroll. He wrote 2 words at the bottom of the final page. The same 2 words he had written in the deep dot, on the scroll of the unnamed light. Then dawn came. Then the work continued. The 2 words Thoth wrote at the bottom of the final scroll, the same 2 words from the deep dot, were never translated into any human language. But the priests who copied his archive copied the space where they should be. They left room for them. That practice continued for 3,000 years. What does it mean? A God of pure wisdom who chose to serve rather than rule, who had every answer and gave them all away, who kept the record of everything and never used the record as leverage. He chose the pen over the throne, not because the pen was safer, because the pen was truer. The throne requires you to decide for everyone. The pen requires you to see everyone clearly. He wanted to see. The throne tells the world what it is. The pen finds out. Thoth chose to find out, every day, for as long as the world continued to produce events worth recording. That was his understanding of power. Not to direct things, to know them. Here is what he protected. Not Egypt. Pharaohs protected Egypt. Not the gods protected themselves. Thoth protected the truth of what happened. The accurate account. The version that doesn't flatter the powerful and doesn't erase the ordinary. That's harder than protecting gold. Gold stays where you put it. Truth has to be chosen every time you write. Every sentence is a decision. Will I say what happened, or what I wish had happened? Thoth made that decision correctly. Every time. For as long as there was a record to keep. Maybe you know what it costs to say the true thing. To write the honest account. To not reach for the version that makes things easier, or makes you look better. Thoth made that choice not once, as a great act, but every day as ordinary practice. He served the living and the dead equally. The gods who needed answers. The souls who needed judgment. The scribes who needed training. The serpent who needed its name remembered. No hierarchy of worthiness. The need was the qualification. And at the end of the longest night, having named the darkness and the stagnation and the chaos, and answered the oldest enemy's question, he went back to the hall. He dipped his pen. He waited for the first soul. The work continued. That's the part that matters most. Not the great acts, the eye restored, the calendar given, the war ended, the chaos answered. But the return, every morning. The return to the ordinary work that the great acts were in service of. The Egyptians understood this. Their word for the scribal craft contained their word for creation. To write was to make. To keep the record was to keep the world. Thoth was not the support for the other gods. He was the condition that made the other gods' actions mean anything at all. Without Thoth, Ra still crosses the sky, but no one would know it had happened. Without Thoth, Horus still rules. But the legitimacy of his rule, written in the verdict that ended the war, would have no foundation. The record makes the world more real than the world is without it. You've been there too. In the moments when someone finally wrote it down. When the thing you experienced was named, recorded, acknowledged. When the record confirmed that what happened was real. That's Thoth's gift, still working. Everywhere you look for it. The God of wisdom chose memory over glory, the archive over the crown, the accurate sentence over the impressive one. And in doing so, he outlasted every pharaoh who ever sat on the throne the archive recorded. The moon wanes every month, because Thoth won too much moonlight in the game of Senate. But every month the moon comes back full. That's not loss and recovery. That's the rhythm, the bet that keeps replaying. Chaos given as time, time returned as light. The 5 extra days still exist in the calendar. We call them differently now, December 27th through 31st, in some ancient reckonings. The days outside the official year. The days where the important births happen. The days Thoth won. The eye of Horus is still carved on amulets. Still worn by people who don't know why it comforts them. Still protecting. Still containing its 64 fractions. 63 of mathematics and 1 of the faith that fills the gap when calculation falls short. Writing still exists. That alone is the longest legacy. Thoth gave language its container. Gave the spoken word a way to persist past the breath that made it. Every book ever written. Every record ever kept. Every name ever preserved. That came from the God who stood at the beginning of the world and named things until they were real. And still, in some version of the Hall of Two Truths, in some architecture of what comes after this, a pen moves. The record continues. The names are still being kept. By the God who never stopped and never will, because the work is never finished. And that is exactly right. He knew everything, he gave it all away. He kept the record. He held the darkness back. He named the things that had no names. He stayed at his desk. He answered the chaos when it asked him if the work was worth it. He said yes. The chaos was satisfied. The dawn came. The work continued. Egypt fell, as all civilizations do. The temples closed one by one. The priests stopped their morning rituals. The scribal schools went quiet. The ibis flocks thinned along the Nile. But the scrolls remained. That was the point of the scrolls. Greek scholars arrived and read what they could. Arab scholars arrived and translated what remained. Medieval monks copied what survived. Renaissance scholars rediscovered what had been lost. The tradition moved, but it never stopped. The word, alchemy, comes from the Arabic, alchmai, which comes from the Greek, ka-maya, which comes from the Egyptian word for the black fertile soil of the Nile Delta. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the black land, the good earth. Thoth's chemistry was always rooted in something that grew things. The Rosetta Stone, the stone that let modern scholars decode hieroglyphs in 1822, was found by a French soldier digging fortifications. The same knowledge Thoth encoded in the world found its way back to the world's understanding through a soldier building a wall. Thoth would have written that down too, and he would have called it fitting. Champollion, the Frenchman who decoded the Rosetta Stone, wept when he finally read the first complete sentence. He said, "It is done." Then he fainted. Thoth, somewhere in the account of all things, probably noted the record of Egypt's language has been restored. The tears were appropriate. Every library in the world carries Thoth's inheritance. Not metaphorically. The practice of organizing knowledge, of giving it a system, of making it findable, of believing it worth keeping. That came from the God who first understood that the record is the thing. Every doctor who writes a patient's history before treating them is practicing the principle of the eye of Horus. That you must first understand the complete picture before you apply the fraction that heals. The chart precedes the cure. That's Thoth. Every journalist who writes what happened, without the version that flatters the powerful, is doing what Thoth did at his desk, while the pharaohs issued their preferred accounts. The accurate record against the convenient one. Every time, that's the practice. And every person who writes down the names of those they love, while there is still time to ask how they want to be remembered, is doing what Thoth asked the young scribe to do. Write the names. Write them carefully. That is preparation. And preparation is the only thing that makes loss survivable. He is still working. In every archive. In every honest sentence. In every morning when the sun comes back and someone writes it down. In the 64th fraction of faith that fills the gap where reason stops. In the blank space left at the bottom of the page. For the two words that cannot be translated, but can be felt by anyone who has stayed long enough in the presence of something they couldn't name. The moon is up. Wherever you are, it is there. The same moon that doth one extra light from. The same moon that waxes and wanes because the game of Senate runs on a monthly cycle that doesn't end. Look at it if you can. Or just know it's there. The Nile is still there too. Still running north. Still flooding and receding on a schedule close to the one Thoth's calendar predicted. Still carrying silt from the mountains to the delta. Still making the black earth that gave alchemy its name. And somewhere in the underworld, in the organized passage of the Doat, the solar barkie is on its crossing. Thoth is at the pro. The night record is being kept. The darkness is being named. The work continues while you rest. You don't have to do anything with this story tonight. You don't have to remember it all. Thoth is keeping the record. That's his part, right now, is simply to rest. The ibis flocks have settled for the night. They stand in the shallows, one leg raised, eyes closed, the way they always have. Thoth's birds resting in Thoth's river, patient, still, already there when morning comes. The Hall of Two Truths is quiet at this hour. The scale is at rest, Maat's feather still, the scrolls sealed for the night. Even the most faithful archivist keeps the hours of darkness as the darkness asks. In silence, in the letting of things be. We'll be here, when you're ready. Another story, another night like this one. Another god who carried something enormous and set it down gently enough that you could sleep beside it. The moon moves west, the stars wheel slowly east, the Doat runs below, the archive grows by one more night. Everything in its place, everything continuing. You are held in all of it. The crack in the oldest stone still glows. Faintly. The potential light that predated Ra still present at the foundation of everything. Not asking to be noticed, just there. The source, patient as the oldest dark. Thoth is writing. Somewhere in the night, in the architecture of all that continues. The pen is moving. The record is growing. Your name is in it. Will always be. Sleep now. The archive keeps itself.